Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. We are continuing our reading of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince and Other Writings. It has been quite informative. We've gotten to see a lot about Italian history, I must say. I have my nice ice black tea with some vanilla syrup I made at home that's organic, and some heavy half and half from grass-fed cows. It's just so good. Only you could try it. Whew, subhanAllah, mashallah. Alright, let's begin. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaeans, among the other praises that have been given him by writers, is celebrated because in times of peace he never thought of anything but the methods of war, and when he was in the country with his friends, he would often stop and reason with them. If the enemy were up on that hill, and we found ourselves here, with our army, which one of us would have the advantage? How could we safely go to attack them, while the maintaining of our formation? So that's an interesting question right there. In Roman military stuff, we saw that formation was really important. Now we don't really have that same thing, but you'll see sometimes, I think they're called the Blue Angels. There's some type of airplane show, and they stay in this triangular formation. And I'm not sure if that has some type of battle thing, or if it's purely cosmetic or mental, but it is fascinating when they maintain a sort of formation. And even in cinema, you can see how the formations were really important. In The Last Kingdom, Uhtred Ragnarsson of Bebember, he taught the English, or that group. I don't know if you can technically call them English, but he was showing them the formations the Danes do, and how to be strong about it. So maintaining that type of shape, or whatever shape you're using, apparently is really important. And then on the hill, sounds like Sun Tzu when we read about advantages of being on the hill, but also about being on the bottom. How could we safely go to attack them while maintaining our formation? If we wanted to retreat, how would we do it? If they retreated, how would we pursue them? And he would put before them, as they were going along, all the contingencies that could occur in an army. He would hear their opinions, give his own, fortify it with arguments, so that through these continual deliberations, no incident whatsoever could occur when he was leading his armies, for which he did not have a remedy. So even in times of peace, he is examining, like, what are we gonna do? How can we make this happen, Captain? And that is smart. I wonder if we have something like that in history with other leaders, but I'm not sure if we do. That are at least have written down when in the times when they have such different modes of fighting, right? But as for exercising the mind, the prince must read histories, and in them consider the actions of eminent men. So you must read the history. So if you're going to be the ruler of men, you want to lead civilizations, you want to be an authority, you need to read histories. I really enjoy reading histories because you get to learn about the mistakes of the past and see what was it like, before our era. But there are some people who think you don't need to read histories, that no history is relevant if it's not to your particular ideology, and I don't agree with that. So to me, it's very important to See what was of those who came before. See how they conducted themselves. Examine the reasons for their victories. Examine the reasons for their victories. That is some potent advice right there. Because people often will talk about how they want to defeat somebody, but how was that particular situation won if you can find it in the past? It's a very interesting thing to note. And defeats in order to be able to avoid the latter and imitate the former. And above all, he must do as some eminent man has done in the past, who chose to imitate someone who, before him, had been praised and glorified, and has always kept his deeds and actions in mind. As it is said, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, and Scipio Cyrus. And whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will then perceive in the life of Scipio how that imitation contributed to his glory, and how in chastity, affability, humanity, liberality, Scipio conformed to what Xenophon wrote about Cyrus. I've never read anything about the life of Cyrus. So, Cyrus, written by Xenophon, so Xeno. Okay. A wise prince must follow similar methods, and in peaceful times never remain idle. In peaceful times never remain idle. That is not easy. I mean, how many times can somebody sit there and just be like, you know what? Everything's chill, just relax, man. What are you so worried about? And letting your guard down. Whew. Sometimes it can make sense, but then other times you can see how it doesn't, huh? It's almost like you have to find the perfect moment when to do that. But by being industrious, he must make capital out of them in order to be able to avail himself of them in times of adversity, so that when fortune changes, she may find him prepared to resist her. So that's a very interesting word to use. Make capital out of them. So by you never really becoming idle, stagnant, you still keep growing in your knowledge. When trouble strikes, and now the tables are shaky, you're gonna have a better chance at resisting being toppled. Wow. Subhanallah. Chapter 15, on the things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It remains now to be seen that It remains now to be seen what the methods and procedures must be for a prince with regard to his subjects and friends, and because I know that many have written about this, I fear that if I write about it again, I may be deemed presumptuous, since I depart, especially in discussing this matter, from the rules given by others. But since my intention is to write something of use for those who understand it, it seemed more suitable to me to go after the effectual truth of the matter than after an imaginary one. That's a cool way to say it. Effectual truth versus the imaginary truth. And then I fear that if I write about it again, I'm presumptuous. His intention is to write something of use for those who understand. And many have imagined republics and principalities for themselves, which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. The utopian, right? For the distance is so great between how we live and how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. Wow. So, the distance between what exists in reality and what ought to be. The way things are versus the way we want them to be. Wow. You're going to go for your ruin rather than your preservation. So the preservation angle he's going at sounds very pragmatic. That's what I'm getting from it. You got to be sort of... You can be an idealist, but don't lose your pragmatism ethic. Because a man who wants to make a profession of goodness in everything is bound to come to ruin among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to preserve himself, to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not use it as necessity dictates. That's an interesting one right there. How does evil operate when you can prepare? That's sort of hints at to why I look a lot at true crime. Like, once you know, like, the twisted, deviant ways of some people, you're a bit less naive, and you don't walk around in paranoia or have eternal skepticism, but you're more vigilant and informed, I'd argue. And this allows a security mindset. And when you see all the deviant ways people go through scamming, I think that would help people be able to fight against cybercrimes and different types of scams, because you're seeing the different faces of evil. It's quite interesting. Leaving aside then the things that have been imagined about the prince and discussing those that are true, I say that all men, when they are spoken of, and especially princes, because they are placed at a greater height, and are judged for some of those qualities which bring them either blame or praise. And this is why one is considered liberal, another miserly, using a Tuscan term, because avaricious, avaro, in our language still means someone who deceives to gain things by theft. Miserly, misero, we call that man who abstains excessively from making use of what is his own. One is considered a giver, another rapacious. One cruel, another merciful. One treacherous, the other loyal. One effeminate, and one cowardly. The other fierce and courageous, one humane, the other haughty. One lascivious, the other chaste. One straightforward, the other cunning. One hard, the other easy. These are very interesting terms here. So, okay, let's see. Avaricious, a miser. I like rapacious, cruelty. These are very interesting terms to use. One straightforward, the other cunning. Now, that's a cool contrast. Aha! So when you're not straightforward and you beat around the bush, you can come to be a bit cunning. That's a very interesting note. Wow, I never thought of that. It's almost like the antonyms. These are sort of like antonyms. One hard, the other easy. One serious, the other frivolous. One religious, the other incredulous. Incredulous, that's a good word I haven't heard for a while. And so on. And I know that everyone will admit that it would be a most praiseworthy thing for a prince to have of all the qualities mentioned above. Those that are held to be good, but since it is impossible to have all of them and to practice any of them completely, because the human condition does not permit it, it is necessary for him to sufficiently... Okay, you see this angle here? That's really smart. So, we see all these traits, right? And a human cannot contain all of them in him. You can't permit all of those in you. But it's like, you still gotta know about them, because your enemy can use them. You don't practice it, but you know about it. That's how I saw, like, about reading, like, just some trickeries that the occultists do. And then some people would think you're promoting it, but rather you're seeing the trickery and you're warning people against it. That's fascinating. For him to be sufficiently prudent so as to know how to avoid the infamy of those vices, which would lose him the state. So vices that will lose one their position and state. And if he can, to guard himself against those which might not lose it for him. Although if he cannot, he can indulge them with less concern. And further, he need not worry about incurring the disgrace of those vices, without which it would be difficult for him to save the state. For if everything is carefully considered, it will be found that something which seems a virtue would, if practiced, become his ruin, and some of the things which seem a vice would, if practiced, result in his security and well-being. So kind of looking at, okay, at this particular moment, it would be seen as a virtue, but if you were to carry it out, it would lead to your ruin. And something may appear to be on the surface looking like a vice, but if you were to do it, it would preserve you. Rapacious, cruel, another merciful, and the one treacherous. So look at that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. Shaitan is most treacherous. If we don't have mercy and practice mercy in the proper way, within the proper framework and proper context, we can become treacherous. The other loyal, one effeminate and cowardly, the other fierce and courageous. So with being effeminate is also paired with being cowardly. So effeminate men are often cowards. So if men are being told to be effeminate and feminine, well, effeminate is like, it's sort of related to being feminine, but it's not masculine. So if a male is effeminate, it often is paired with cowardice, whereas fierce is more something that has courage. Because unless it's like a very fierce wrath, but if you're looking at war, if you're part of the cavalry and you're the first charging in, you gotta swing that sword, and you gotta not back down when that hunger in the other man's eyes is coming for you. One humane, the other haughty. So humane being opposite than being haughty. Humane, you see almost the humanity, you see the dignity of the individual, whereas haughty, it's almost like you are really degrading that person to a sub-base standard. And we're told not to be haughty as Muslims, to not walk as a haughty, arrogant, boastful one throughout the earth. Okay, there's some notes here that we should read. Machiavelli speaks of effectual truth, verita effettuale, because he is interested in a truth that has an effect. A truth that has an effect, that is, leads to action in the world. Well, who knew that to think of truth in that way? Examining truth and then saying to yourself, does this truth lead to any effect in the actual world? Rather than a truth that is more purely speculative or contemplative and thus impractical. Ooh, spicy, slapping me as a philosopher. How dare you. So speculative truths, contemplative truths are more impractical than effectual truths that can lead to some sort of action in the world. So I guess if one wanted to make sure they was doing some good, drop some truths and then be solution based, I guess. 2. Machiavelli is thinking here of books such as Plato's Republic, as well as of traditional books of advice for princes, which always stress the necessity of following the dictates of conventional morality. More's Utopia. I have that on my bookshelf, Thomas More's Utopia. I found a vintage copy. No one's touched it or scribbled in it. It's right there in the bookshelf. I have that. That'll be the next one we read. Once we crack down on the list we have already. It's one of the reasons why I'm really maxing out the minute counts on each one so we can bust these books out. Because now my schedule's being more free. Because the little toddler is older now. And might also seem to be a kind of book Machiavelli is aiming in this passage. It was actually composed several years after The Prince. Okay, cool. So I have Plato's Republic. I have More's Utopia. Okay, so fascinating that that's brought up. Okay, now, oh cool. I think this is gonna be spicy. Chapter 16 of Liberty and Miserliness. Sorry, liberality. Those liberality and miserliness are the opposites of each other. Beginning therefore with the first qualities mentioned above, I say that it would be a good to be considered generous. Okay. It would be good to be considered generous. Nevertheless, generosity used in such a way as to give you a reputation for it will harm you. Because if it is used virtuously, virtuosamente, and as it is supposed to be used, it will not be recognized, and you will not avoid the infamy of its opposite. Ooh. Well, so let's examine that. You want to be someone who isn't seen as cheap and who is generous. In Islam, who will give Allah a goodly loan, we have that phrase. And whatever good deed we do will be doubly rewarded for us and the afterlife. But could there be people who use your generosity to harm you? Yeah, for sure. And therefore, if someone wants to maintain a reputation among men for liberality, it is necessary to avoid omitting any kind of sumptuous display, with the result that a prince so disposed will consume all his wealth in such activities. Yeah, but you don't want to be a spendthrift. We have that in Islam as well. You don't want to be a spendthrift. Your family has a right over you. You don't just have to give and give until you're a pauper. You have to be smart with your finances. But I understand his point that some people will spend their bank and go into debt just so that they can be seen as generous. And he will at last be compelled, if he wants to maintain his reputation for liberality, to impose a heavy tax burden on the people. Now that's a fascinating angle. So your leader, he has his wealth. He likes to be generous, but he's gone a little bit too far. And then he sees the stuff going down because the king gets wealth from levying taxes. And now the burden is too high. This totally makes me think about how the United States will give aid to everyone in the world. And it's like, the United States, help us, feed us, do this, or give us money for weapons. And meanwhile, the tax rate's going up on us. And we are pinched, we are turned upside down and shaking the coins from our pockets. And so that the United States can keep up that aura of the world police and the saviors of humanity and whatnot. But it's actually diluting the citizens' purchasing power. And the government can only get its tax revenue from the people paying these taxes. So they give money to Ukraine. They're like, this is really generous. But when you see our own people suffering, they can't afford housing, they're drowning in student debt, gas is expensive, health insurance is quite high. You begin to see like, uh-oh, he has a point here when you really start to look at that and become an extortionist and do everything that can be done to get money. So if you're too generous, you're going to get yourself into trouble and you're going to become an extortionist. And you're going to just really try to see what can you do to get money. So it's almost like it flips on you, he's contending. You wanted to be considered good and generous. You got that reputation for it. But then it starts to harm you in the end because you become an extortionist and you put a heavy tax burden on the citizens. And you just are constantly hungering like a dragon for more coins. This will begin to make him hateful to his subjects, and being poor he will not be much esteemed by anyone, so that having by this liberality harmed many and benefited few, he will feel very little disturbance and will be ruined at the first appearance of danger. When he recognizes this and wants to extricate himself from it, he immediately becomes infamous as a miser. Oh, wow. That was a solid presentation. Look at that. So, he's taxing them into the poorhouse. Okay? They're going to get pissed off. Like, hey man, you're being generous, but you're trying to do this, you're trying to do that, but you're putting too much on us. You're becoming a spendthrift. And maybe he's going into debt. Maybe he's putting the nation into debt, right? And it's not really benefiting as much people as he thought. So when there's danger, maybe when there's a coup, when there's something going on, he's going to be really looked down upon, and maybe he realizes he'll look down upon and it'll put his seat of power at risk. But I find it fascinating he ends it here with that he'll actually become a miser. So you start off wanting to be generous, but it spirals out of control. And then when you're just hungry for more money and then you realize, I kind of spent too much, then you got to pull back. And so when you pull back, people will call you a miser because you're now cutting back. Wow, that's a good observation. I wonder if he saw that with different aristocrats in Italy, because I'm sure he saw some fancy lords and ladies totally ruin stuff for themselves. Therefore, since a prince cannot practice this virtue of liberality so that he gets a reputation for it without harming himself, he must not, if he is prudent, care about being called a miser. Oops. Well, maybe there's a middle ground here. Because over time he will always be considered more generous when it is seen that because of his miserliness, his income is sufficient. He can defend himself from anyone who makes war on him, and he can undertake enterprises without burdening his people. So notice this here. Defend himself from anyone who makes war on him, and undertaking enterprises without burdening the people. The result will be that he will come to appear generous to all those from whom he takes nothing, who are numberless, and miserly to all those to whom he gives nothing, who are few. In our times we have not seen great things done, except by those who have been considered miserly. I don't know if I agree with that, but man, let's see where he's going with it. And others have come to ruin. Pope Julius II, although he had made use of a reputation for liberality in order to attain the papacy, decided not to maintain it afterward. He slept it about so that he could wage wars. I thought Christians didn't do wars. I thought they were pacifists. What? I thought that they just said, give me the other cheek and trample on me. I thought it was extreme to go to war. You telling me there was popes who led wars? I'm being facetious, you know it. The present king of France has waged many wars without imposing an extra tax on his people, because his additional expenses were taken care of by his long practiced parsimony. Okay, so budgeting. What are we getting from this? Budgeting. He mentioned capital. Remember? And then in the previous section, not only in times of peace should you be thinking of war strategies, not just, you should be taking advantage of the peace given to you to learn more. That's sort of how I see stay-at-home moms. Like, you have been given a chance to study, you should study as much as you can. Because, college isn't the only place you can gain knowledge. And so, maximize your time. Him mentioning, maximizing your time as a leader to study war in times of peace is just important. And when he's talking about budgeting and how it can be perceived as miserliness, it's better for you to budget, and that way you will be able to actually wage wars without overburdening your people. Whereas if you're too much of a spendthrift, you're draining your treasury, and now you're overburdening your people and they hate you. Really sounds like America. You look at how many wars we've led, how much aid we give to the world, how much the national debt is, how much debt each citizen has. It's not a good system. And eventually the bald eagles with horses and the American flag waving and corn dogs at the state fair, the breads and circuses, aren't really going to keep people that happy. And this is when many people talk about the own citizens of America. Once they stop loving their country, they'll accept another country to come in and take over, another type of regime or something. So him mentioning that the ruler won't be protected from danger because the citizens won't love that ruler or the nation is quite potent. He's mentioned this before in the past chapters. The present king of Spain, if he had had a reputation of generosity, would not have engaged in and won so many campaigns. Fascinating. Therefore, in order to avoid robbing his subjects, avoid robbing your subjects. Look at the taxes. Now, we do have a lot of socialists now that are socialists / communists, even though those are kind of different economic orders. But heavy taxation, it seems to be becoming more and more desirable to people. Tax instead of less taxes. They want taxes for social programs, but they don't realize, by also taxing people into oblivion, you take away everyone's capital, how much they could actually take home. Therefore, in order to avoid robbing his subjects, to be able to defend himself, to avoid becoming poor and contemptible, and to avoid being forced to become rapacious. Forced to become rapacious. So, remember when he said that you'll become an extortionist in order to get money because you've consumed all your wealth? So if you do that, you're going to have to become money hungry then, in a different manner than, let's say, a millionaire who is just greedy, or a billionaire and he's like, I must get more money. He's a machine. He just loves money. He's Scrooge McDuck, right? But if you're the ruler and you're being a spendthrift, you're indebting your empire, well, now you're going to become rapacious to get out of it because you got to fight your way out of the mud. You got to fight your way out of the hole you dug. A prince must not be greatly concerned about acquiring reputation for miserliness, for this is one of those vices that enables him to reign. Ooh. That's an interesting take. That miserliness, it's a vice, but it allows him to reign. Now, his miserliness is in a different category than I think than personal miserliness, because if you don't give to charity, you don't do what you can to help your community, this causes problems. But a ruler, he's in charge of many subjects, and he has to keep a certain amount in that vault in order to keep things running. So I wonder. But it's fascinating to think about, that's for sure. And if someone should say that Caesar attained imperial rule through liberality, and many others have reached the highest ranks through having been generous. So if you recall, in the Lives of the Caesars, we read that, I should get back to that book, but we read that Caesar, he gave a lot of lavish gifts. One could argue that's bribery, but he bought his friends. A lot of good that did him on the Senate floor. But it was one way in which he rose through the ranks. So this brings up the question of what is really generosity and what is bribery? And having had a reputation for liberality, I reply, you are either a prince already, or you are on the way to acquiring that rank. In the first case, this liberality is harmful. In the second, it is indeed necessary to be considered generous. So if you want to rise up, you have to be seen as generous, but then once you acquire your position, you flip it. And Caesar was one of those who wanted to attain princely rule over Rome. But if, after having achieved it, he had survived, and he had not moderated those expenditures, he would have destroyed his empire. Moderated those expenditures. Moderated expenditures. Sort of sounds like when certain jobs, they'll pay all these benefits to their employees, but then when they realize they can't afford it, they have to pass the buck on to the consumer through expensive food on the menu, or they have to simply cut down the amount of staff they have. It's fascinating when you think about how they try to be generous with benefits and perks, but it's all about how many margins they can keep, right? And should someone reply, so they can weather the storm, and should someone reply that there have been many princes who have done great things with their armies and have been reputed to be extremely generous, I reply to you, the prince may either spend his own wealth, the prince may either spend his own wealth and that of his subjects, or the wealth of others. In the first case, he must be frugal. So he must be frugal in spending from his own wealth. In the second, he must not omit any aspect of liberality or on his subjects, the wealth of others. And that the prince who marches with his armies and lives by looting, sacking, and extortion is making use of what belongs to others. Oh, that's cool. That's a really good point that I never realized. So when you have the war booty, you've sacked the city, you've gotten the war booty. When you paid a ransom, it's kind of like an extortion. When you've taken a sort of caravan or something like that, it's sort of like looting. But the spoils of war. So the spoils of war is making use of wealth that's others and then giving that to your soldiers and then being generous through spoils of war. Spoils of war. Generosity. You see, that's so, it makes me think of the campaigns of the Prophet, peace be upon him, like Uthman had his own wealth, and he was generous with giving for that. But the war booty was shared. So this gets hold of the concept of just how you have to pay your soldiers well. Caesar, remember, he gave land to his soldiers. Slaves. You pass the wealth around. For him, this generosity is necessary. Otherwise, he would not be followed by his soldiers. Exactly. Look at that. Ooh, I think that's another thing about America has failed at. They have made the Veterans Association, it's dysfunctional. There's homeless veterans, veterans suffering with mental health. They don't get the help they need. They're totally neglected. Sent back traumatized, bruised, and broken with nothing to really show for it. And some of them have to even finagle to get their college paid for. And so what was the generosity that the United States showed towards their soldiers? Besides Memorial Day. Besides veteran discounts at some Golden Corral buffet. Think about it. Patriotism seems to also come about when the government is generous with its soldiers. Because then you actually feel proud of your homeland. We're learning quite a lot. You can see why he's been renowned for so long. And with what does not belong to you or your subjects, it is possible to be more liberal giver, as were Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander. For spending what belongs to others does not take away from your reputation, but adds to it. Oh, that's so smart. That is so smart. This is pretty cool. So when you sack a city, you might try to hoard that wealth, like it's all mine. But in reality, the soldiers did help you win it, and that's the moment where your generosity is tested. Give it to them, because if you give to them, they'll give to you. Only by spending your own do you harm yourself. Only by spending your own do you harm yourself. That's your personal vault, right? And there is nothing that consumes itself so much as liberality. There is nothing that consumes itself so much as liberality. It's fascinating. While you are using it, you are losing the possibility of losing it. That's so true. That is so true. And you are becoming either poor or contemptible, or to escape poverty, rapacious and hated. So, the more liberal you become, the more liberal you become with your spending, you actually lose the possibility of actually being able to do that in the first place. You really gotta rein it back. It can make you poor and contemptible. Oh, you had money, what'd you do? You spent yourself into poverty, you're an idiot, you're a moron. Fascinating. In order to get out of that, now you gotta hunt for that dollar. Make it holla. And above all things, that a prince must guard himself against is being despised and hated. Do you see that? Joe Biden is hated. He's deeply hated. But social media is able to fake it till you make it. And bots, AI has really caused some problems with, because democracy is also a form of popularity. That's another angle. So, when you're hated, you're not really going to get into power. And there's so much you can say about voter frauds and stuff like that, but it's fascinating. Electronic voting, the systems, paper ballots, it's all interesting when you examine it. How a democracy can totally be hijacked and rigged. It's fascinating. Is a theocracy more stable, where the rulers are loved and protected by the people? It's really something to think about. But regardless, he contends that the leaders shouldn't be hated and despised. And liberality will lead you to both. Therefore, there is more wisdom in having the reputation of a miser, which begets infamy without hatred, than because you want to be considered generous, to be forced to acquire a reputation for rapacity, which begets infamy and hatred. Fascinating. Okay, he says here, Machiavelli's remarks about Julius II and Louis XII of France and Ferdinand of Spain are accurate. All were as fiscally prudent as they were committed to warfare. Fiscally prudent. So we were on the right track. Fiscally prudent. So he uses the word miser, right? And usually when we hear the word miser, as a Muslim, we're like, hold up. You gotta take care of the orphans, you gotta do your job. But I think they use it as like, you are being responsible fiscally, and the ignoramus will call you a miser, when in reality, you're being responsible. And that's something to think about. Fascinating. Is it better to be feared or loved? As a ruler has been a classic trope for a long time. He contends that if you are too liberal in your spending. You want to be seen as generous. Because you think it's a virtue. Because being generous is a virtue, but he's contending as a ruler. You're trying to follow that virtue of generosity. You're going to really reduce your treasury. And you won't have money for your soldiers. And it's going to be a problem. But yet, what's interesting is he gives you the parameters of how you can be generous and when. The conditions. And so, you need to be very frugal with your money. You need to be careful, okay? But you need, because like the purchasing power of your subjects and yourself, you must be careful. But with the wealth of others, well, now you can be generous, because the war booty from looting, sacking, and extortion and all that, well, that can be shared and distributed amongst the soldiers. And you should be generous towards your soldiers. Otherwise, they ain't gonna follow you. They're risking their lives for you. What's in it for them? Cash money. So, it's fascinating. So, he gave an example of Pope Julius being the example of someone who done messed up, but then said that Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander, they had a form of giving back to their soldiers, and that was a generosity that benefited them and the empire. And also, if you think about it, it would make people want to be recruited. They feel like they're going to get something back. Okay. Oh my goodness, I just mentioned it's better to be loved and feared, as the quote in chapter 17 says, on cruelty and mercy, and whether it is better to be loved or feared, or the contrary. And I didn't even see that. Oh, that's awesome. Pretty cool. But he just said here, though, you need to guard against being despised and hated. So, the opposite of hate is love. How fear plays a role? I wonder. If you recall in Game of Thrones, Daenerys Targaryen had that when Jon was pulling away from her, and they found out they're relatives, and she goes, it's better to be feared. And then she becomes completely psycho and burns down King's Landing. She's no longer loved. When she went to Meereen, she was loved by the people as a liberator. And Cersei was feared. She was not loved. And the people, they obeyed Cersei, and they did not rebel in that same way. But the Unsullied and the Dothraki chose to follow Daenerys because I wouldn't say they feared her, but they had respect for her veracity and the ability of her dragons to flame things. And she could be cruel by torturing the city. Cruelty upon the masters, right? When she told the people to uprise against their masters, their slave masters, and then she crucified them because they had crucified slaves. So, to them, that type of cruelty, see, this is the thing about cruelty, is that we often play with it, don't we? When Cersei got revenge on the Sand Snake by putting her in that dark cell with the same poison she used on Cersei's daughter, we got to see that Cersei got revenge. It's a cruel end, but that lady was cruel to Cersei's daughter, Marcella, and then she gets the same thing back, which is support of justice. So Cersei was to be feared, pardon me, and Tywin was feared. When, if you recall, when Jaime was taken, he was like, if people can attack our house with impunity and with no punishment, then we're no longer a house to be feared. And if you look at it, fear does play a role in how a lot of rulers are. You don't want to be a tyrant throughout the land. People will come together to dethrone you because you're just too atrocious. But recall when Lady Marjorie was, her and her grandma were really loved, but who was there to save them when Cersei took them out? Took down the house, right, when they were in the war. And then, remember the famous quote, "You are a dragon, be a dragon." So Tyrion was advising Daenerys to have the love angle, which Jon favored. And the Queen of Thorns was saying, be a dragon. The dragon's to be feared. It's not to be loved. It's a flying reptile that breathes fire. And if you're a dragon rider, you're to be feared. You know? It's fascinating when you think about just how that series has so many of these examples that Niccolo Machiavelli is hitting on and that have been talked about a lot. I think I've always said this, though, you have to have a bit of both. I do understand, though, that people think you can be a sort of pacifist. It's like, everybody eat grass, man. We don't even eat bugs. We just breathe air in order to survive. And it's like, you gotta be careful, man. You gotta be careful. But mercy, the balance between cruelty and mercy, and the balance of wanting approval via love versus knowing how to hold the line and accept that some people should fear you and that you should be feared. You know, because when people fear you, they don't test the limits as much because they know that you don't play. I mean, how many times, like, I knew people, you didn't want to mess with them, and if you were going to challenge them, you better watch your mouth. And then people who are big pushovers, when they tell you something, you're like, whatever. Like, it doesn't hit you the same way, right? And so that's something to think about when you're dealing with this important question. So next time, that's going to be very philosophical because it's an age-old question. And you can look at history. Mary Tudor, she was burned, people. Was she loved? Elizabeth, the daughter of King Henry VIII, who lived in the time of Shakespeare, like, you know, and she saw Shakespearean plays. She was said to be loved. And it's an interesting question. Who would we obey more? Those who we loved or those who we feared? Think about it in your job. The manager you love, will you obey them? Or the one you fear, will you obey them? Something to think about. When the one you fear walks in, you start cleaning, you start doing what you're supposed to do. When the one you love walks in, you kind of just keep doing what you were doing. You're not on as much alert. So, something to think about. But definitely, like he said, you don't want to be despised and you don't want to be hated. Very cool. If you'd like to support my work, you can do so via my blog, which is www.subscribestar.com/MilahanArchive. Hope to see you there.